dusty dowries, and drifting candles. Hello folks, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval girls caught in the marriage market of the 1300s. Before they could even spell their own names, some were being measured for alliances, judged by the fullness of their dowry and the thickness of their cloak hems. Their futures were not imagined with dreams of love, but priced out in bolts of cloth and chickens. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval hall is low lit and smoky, and the air carries a stew of aromas. Stale rushes a damp hearth, a suspicious hint of boiled turnip, and the unmistakable tension of negotiation. Seated on a plain wooden bench is a girl 12, maybe 13. Her hands are folded neatly in her lap, but she is not fidgeting. She knows not to fidget. Just beyond the woven curtain, her father and two other men are finalizing what is essentially her future, and none of them seem inclined to ask what she thinks about it. Dowries in the 1300s were not just customary, they were essential. Think of them as medieval starter kits for brides, a package of value to sweeten the deal. Grease the alliance and assure everyone that the bride would not arrive empty. Handed or worse, empty-headed, a typical dowry might include livestock, the more functional the better, a few linen sheets, some kitchenware, and if the family was feeling generous, a single tarnished necklace from an aunt who swore it was once touched by a nun. For families with modest means, dowries were stressful, exhausting affairs. You did not just give away a daughter, you transferred responsibility, and if the bundle of cloth hens and reputation did not measure up to expectation, the whole plan could unravel faster than a wool tunic near a candle among nobles. Of course, the stakes were higher and infinitely pettiest. Land deals were negotiated alongside marriage contracts, turning betrothals into mini diplomatic summits. A daughter could be married off to secure a peace treaty, cancel a debt, or gain the favor of a cousin's cousin's liege. Lord's brother-in-law who happened to own a river-crossing romance, as you might imagine, was rarely in the equation. Historians still argue whether dowries functioned as a woman's early inheritance or as leverage used to control her movements and obligations after marriage. Either way, the fact remains, dowries dictated the terms of a girl's life long before she ever stood beside a church altar in the hall. The girl's mother adjusts her veil, glancing at her daughter with a smile that is meant to reassure. It does not everyone knows what is happening, but no one is talking about it directly. Even the priest, standing quietly by the wall, with an expression somewhere between neutral and mildly bored. Is there more for witness than blessing? The church might preach spiritual equality, but it certainly did not mind lending legitimacy to property transactions disguised as holy unions. Unless you think this process was always dry and humorless, here is a tidbit that might surprise you. In some villages, it was common to include a symbolic trinket in the dowry, like a carved spoon or a single cherry stone from a tree that never bore fruit again. These were little tokens meant to bring luck or to mark the uniqueness of the bride's superstition, wrapped in sentimentality. Imagine giving your future in-laws a symbolic twig and saying this means our daughter cries less than average. The negotiation itself might take place over tankards of ale and a half-eaten loaf of rye bread. There is likely a minor argument about whether a second goose qualifies as generosity or showboating. The girl still silent. Her value at this point has been appraised more thoroughly than the family cow. Mainstream historical records confirm that in many medieval communities, girls as young as 12 could be legally betrothed and sometimes married with parental consent. It was not unusual. It was not scandalous. It was just Tuesday life expectancy. Hovered in the 40s if you were lucky. Childhood did not stretch long, and puberty was treated less as a phase and more like an administrative green light. Once the match was agreed, the betrothal might be marked by a formal blessing or simply by the passing of a sealed document and a nod in rural areas. The rituals were even simpler. Sometimes all it took was a handclasp in front of witnesses and a gift exchange. One story tells of a father who finalized his daughter's engagement by handing the groom a candle. Romantic rite, a flaming stick, and a legal binding. What could possibly go wrong outdoors? The sky is darkening, and the wind curls in under the threshold. Inside, the girl is handed a folded cloth embroidered stiff, something her aunt stitched while squinting by candlelight. It will be packed along with the dowry, a marker of her new household. She does not say anything as she folds it again and sets it on her lap in towns, especially those with any kind of merchant class. Matchmaking was often handled with the help of middlemen, or in some cases middle nuns. Convents sometimes arranged marriages between families who had previously feuded, using the union as a peace treaty and a prayer for stability. The fact that the bride was a literal human olive branch did not strike anyone as strange. There were also practical matters to settle. What happens if the groom dies before the wedding? Does the dowry stay with his family? Can it be reclaimed? These were real concerns. Legal loopholes were a medieval pastime. Some families even wrote contracts with clauses like, if the groom is found to have lice beyond a tolerable quantity, this contract may be nullified. Let that sink in. You could be released from your marriage deal. On the grounds of excessive lice, medieval prenups had range. Meanwhile, the girl sits through it all with a face trained into calmness. She knows what is expected: obedience, silence, grace. The way she walks, the way she places her hands, even the way she drinks water. These things have all been rehearsed, because when your marriage is your family's best shot at survival, your posture becomes a form of currency. You might think this all sounds transactional, and you would be right. But tucked inside the cold calculus were quiet moments. A mother brushing back a strand of hair, an older cousin sneaking a smile, a whispered joke behind a raised goblet. Affection was not absent. It was just buried beneath protocol, wrapped in obligation, and occasionally hidden under a pile of chickens later, as the hall empties and the fire burns lower. The girl will be told the name of her future husband. Maybe she already knows it. Maybe he is 15 and shy. Maybe he is 32 and owns a small orchard. Maybe she saw him once at the harvest fair and remembers only that he wore too much green. The future is no longer hers to shape. But then again, in this world, it never really was in the medieval world. Age was more than just a number. It was a social deadline by the when 12 meant marriage material. Time a girl turned 12, she was no longer a child in the eyes of her community. She was considered marriage material. A phrase that now sounds like a bad punchline, but back then was simply the truth. You could say that girlhood had a short shelf life, especially if the family farm needed consolidating, or a local alliance was ripe for the picking. In towns and rural villages alike, church bells often rang to announce not just holy days, but marriage intentions, and sometimes the bell tolled for girls who had barely figured out how to plait their hair. It was not shocking. It was not whispered. It was normal. You might wonder how anyone thought that was acceptable, but to be fair, medieval people had different definitions of childhood puberty. Was nature's way of handing out wedding invitations. And let us not forget the church's complicity. Canon law technically allowed marriage for girls as young as 12 and boys at 14, provided there was consent. Though consent could mean a lot of things, like not crying too loudly during the ceremony. While consummation was sometimes delayed, the contract of marriage itself was often sealed far earlier. locking two families and two futures into a deal, made more for politics than personal preference. Picture a stone church filled with damp wool and half-suppressed coughs. Candles sputter in the draft, their wax dripping like nervous sweat. A priest reads the banns announcing that Matilda, daughter of a local miller, will marry a boy she has spoken to exactly. When he handed her a stick of dried quinces at the Michaelmas fair, she did not like quince. She will now, by necessity in these situations. No one asked whether she was ready to raise children, keep house, or manage accounts. Readiness was not part of the conversation. Biological capability and social expectation were the only metrics that mattered. And if she looked tall enough to stir a pot and carry firewood, well, congratulations. She was of age. Some households even prepared their daughters for betrothal. As soon as they started showing signs of puberty, mothers would discreetly mention their availability to neighbors. Fathers would begin calculating how much cloth could be spared from the winter weaving to sweeten a deal. Older women, especially widows, played a critical role too, passing along the subtler politics of presentation. How to bow just enough, speak softly without mumbling, and smile in a way that said modest but still fertile. The girls, for their part, adapted. With the resilience of people who had never known. They had choices. They played games in the yard one month and tried on betrothal veils the next. It was a pivot less jarring when everyone around you treated it as simply the way things worked. There is a haunting detail here that sometimes slips through historical cracks. The concept of childhood as a protected extended phase of life simply did not exist. Children were miniature adults in training. They were expected to contribute to the household, learn their gendered roles early, and transition into those roles as soon as physically possible. If that sounds exhausting. It was, but it was also ordinary. Even aristocratic girls were not exempt. In fact, they often faced more pressure, more scrutiny, and even less autonomy. Their marriages were planned at birth and rearranged like chess pieces based on which uncle had fallen out of favor or which estate needed uniting. It was not uncommon for a noble girl to be promised at 5, betrothed by 8, and married by 12, ceremonially, if not practically. Unless we forget, love rarely entered the conversation. Affection might develop later if you were lucky, or it might not. There is a recorded case of a noble woman who met her husband for the first time at their wedding. Her main observation: he had a wart on his ear and smelled strongly of mustard. A stunning start to marital bliss. Historians still debate whether these young brides truly understood what was happening. Some argue that many were sheltered and naive, entering into marriage with little comprehension. Others point out that children in medieval households were often exposed to adult responsibilities early and may have known more than we give them credit for. But either way, comprehension was not a requirement. Obedience was. And in the village streets, children often mimicked the adults they saw. Young girls played house, but not in the tiny tea set, since they practiced sweeping, spinning wool, rocking imaginary babies. The performance of adulthood began early and was usually treated as charming preparation. Rather than troubling mimicry, here is a fringe detail worth knowing. Some rural communities celebrated a girl's first menstruation with quiet rituals, less as a personal milestone and more as a signal to the community. It was not shouted from the rooftops, but the news would travel, and suddenly that girl would find her name spoken in new tones. At the market, less she helps her mother with the goats, more she will make a fine wife once the dowry is ready. And yes, the pressure came from all sides. A girl's worth was heavily tied to her ability to marry well, or at least decently. If her family was poor, the pressure might come with urgency. If her family was rich, it came with strategy, but it always came the church. Ever watchful, played a peculiar double role. On one hand, they emphasized consent and spiritual purity. On the other hand, they routinely blessed the unions of girls whose opinions were largely theoretical. One famous preacher even advised that parents should marry off their daughters early to avoid the sins of lust, as if the only way to avoid trouble was to throw a child into it headfirst. With a man twice her age, occasionally a young bride would enter a household where she was treated kindly. The mother-in-law might take her under her wing. The husband might wait before making demands. But these were exceptions, not guarantees. And even then, she was still expected to manage household duties. Begin preparing for children and be pleasant to guests who pinched her cheeks and offered backhanded compliments, like she will be comely when she fills out. It is a lot. Yes, but the girls did not always crumble under the weight of it. Some adapted, some endured. A few even negotiated quietly, cleverly, through soft refusals and careful alliances with their mother or servants. Others found small freedoms in storytelling and festivals, in friendships with other girls caught in the same net. So when the church bells rang and a pale, wide-eyed 12-year-old walked down the aisle in borrowed shoes, you did not hear gasps or scandal. You heard approval. You saw neighbors nod. You saw the priest smile. You saw another contract completed. Another girl reshaped into someone else's future. Because in the 1300s, the age of marriage was not a milestone. It was a finish line, and some girls were expected to cross it before they had even learned how to run. Fathers, fields, and fates sealed over ale. It often began not with a priest or even with the girl, but with a father and maybe a neighbor, a cousin, a merchant from 2 villages over, sitting on a worn wooden bench, talking over mugs of lukewarm ale. The air thick with barley and smoke would host a conversation that might drift from livestock to rainfall, then casually slide into far more consequential territory. So your daughter is nearly of age then. The 1300s marriage market was not a literal market, though. One could be forgiven for the confusion. It was quieter, more ambient, like a low-pressure system that settled over a village. It emerged not through ceremony but through convenience and seasonal necessity and sometimes boredom. The kinds of deals that shaped young girls' futures often began with phrases like, "Would it not be something if and ended with an exchange of chicken's land or promises no one intended to keep, while aristocrats fussed over lineage and the finer points of heraldry. The rural folk struck matches between families based on who had grain, who had goats, and who had too many mouths to feed. A marriage could solve problems before they even fully arrived. Too many sons on one farm, marry one off and send him packing. Too few daughters to cook the barley and churn the butter better, get one from down the lane. It is easy to imagine these arrangements as heartless, but they were not always there. Was care in the way, a carpenter might smooth the edges of a stool. He is about to sell. The girl's father was not necessarily cruel. He was pragmatic if the house leaked. The cow was limping and the thatch needed replacing before winter. His daughter's wedding might be the solution he needed. And in a world where few things were certain, a good marriage deal was as close to security as one could hope for. The terms of the match might be discussed over multiple days, with breaks for church bread and more ale. Each side would try to position themselves as both. Generous and burdened, the girl's family might highlight her skills. She can churn butter. She is quiet. She sings psalms without complaint. The boy's side might admit with noble reluctance that he is not the handsomest lad, but he owns 3 pairs of boots. And is that not more useful? Really, negotiations were rarely just about the couple. They were about alliances. A marriage could mean shared grain during hard times, access to a well, fewer feuds, or even joint ownership of an especially fat sow. If the groom's cousin had once insulted the bride's uncle, well, now they would have to share bread at a wedding feast and pretend they never tried to poison each other's stew. Younger daughters listening through doors or peering from the loft, learned early that their future would be settled at these tables. They recognized the shift in tone, the glance from their father that said, "You will wear the blue dress tomorrow." Sometimes they even smiled and nodded at the visitor in question, practicing politeness, like a second language. And when the guest left, they would stare at the bench where he sat, wondering if they were meant to feel anything in particular. Historians still debate whether peasant girls had more agency in marriage than their noble counterparts. Some argue that in lower classes, there was more room for personal choice, more chance of marrying someone familiar. Others point out that survival needs often bulldozed personal preference, and a girl's opinion could be as easily ignored by a farmer as by a king. In the end, consent was often assumed rather than requested, and this brings us to one of the more quietly brutal truths of the medieval marriage market. Once the fathers had agreed over ale bread or a shared joke, the betrothal might as well have been carved into stone. The girl would be informed, dressed appropriately, and expected to behave with humility and ideally enthusiasm if she was lucky. The match would be with someone roughly her age, someone she had seen around the village. If she was less lucky, it might be an older widower looking for a replacement wife with children, barely younger than she was. And if she was very unlucky, it might be someone her father owed a favor to, an arrangement designed to settle debts rather than raise a family. There are documented cases where the girl refused outright, though such defiance came at a cost. Daughter who resisted too loudly could be labeled difficult, prideful, or touched. In some villages, a girl could gain a reputation. After a single bad betrothal, whispers would follow her to market, and future matches would vanish like mist. Of course not. Every match was grim. Some couples grew fond of each other. They shared jokes. They developed rhythms. A husband might carve her a comb or bring her the first egg from the hens. Affection was not impossible. It was simply not required. An affection that bloomed after marriage was considered a blessing, like a warm spring after a harsh winter. And if she cried, that was not necessarily taken as a sign of resistance. Tears were often dismissed as nerves or excitement, or just typical female frailty. A girl could be weeping into her sleeve and still be praised for her composure, so long as she stood where she was told, and did not drop the ceremonial bread. The girl's performance was as much a part of the contract as the chicken's. She was expected to be modest, but not dull, quiet, but not mute, pleasing, but not provocative. She was a walking mirror of her family's honor, and every crease in her gown, every misplaced hairpin, reflected back on the people who raised her. The groom's family, meanwhile, conducted their inspection with the solemnity of traders evaluating a plow. Was she healthy? Broad hips, clean skin. No obvious limp. Could she lift a bucket? Did her laugh sound too sharp? Too sly? A little wit was fine, but too much could mean trouble, and no one wanted to marry a girl who might argue about how many geese should be in the barn. One strange but telling detail. From some records, families occasionally included a clause that the bride should not bring bad dreams or unlucky smells into the household. Whether this meant spiritual superstition or just a history of digestive upset is unclear, but the fear of misfortune was never far away. The economics of marriage bled into every part of the arrangement. A father might try to inflate his daughter's desirability by exaggerating her dowry. She will come with 2 goats and half an acre, he might say, leaving out the fact that one goat was blind and the acre flooded every spring. The groom's father, not to be outdone, would mention his son's future inheritance, glossing over the fact that the land in question was technically owned by the abbey and full of nettles. Everyone pretended politely that all promises would be kept. No one brought up the realities of famine or plague, or a failed barley crop. Weddings were a brief moment of optimism, wrapped in food song and mutual deceit. And when the day finally came, the the bride would walk toward her new life wearing shoes she barely recognized, beside a man whose name she had only recently learned to spell. That night, as the hall emptied and the guests stumbled home, her father would sit with his ale and exhale. Another daughter matched, another burden lifted, another deal sealed, not in ink, but in bread boots, and the quiet click of expectations locking into place. The matchmakers with monastic haircuts, inside monasteries that smelled faintly of candle wax and damp stone decisions, were made with quiet authority behind thick walls and under arched ceilings. Monks and clerics did more than pray and copy manuscripts. They negotiated marriages, not for themselves, of course, but for the noble families who trusted their discretion, their wisdom, and their absolute ability to keep secrets. In the 1300s, many noble families turned to monastic institutions for matchmaking services. These were not romantic endeavors. These were calculations, performed with quill and ink, with bloodlines traced across parchment, and with regional alliances arranged like tiles in a mosaic. A monk with access to several family trees and a decent knowledge of who had recently died could secure the future of a girl he had never met. All before breakfast, one might imagine monks as detached from worldly matters, but the truth was more nuanced. Many were born into noble households themselves and understood the delicate politics of inheritance and reputation. They served as intermediaries, brokers of virtue and lineage, filtering through potential matches. With all the detachment of someone choosing the least rotten apple from a basket of bruised fruit, monasteries also held records: births, baptisms, deaths, previous betrothals, details that made or broke a proposed union. If a girl had been previously promised to a cousin who tragically fell into a pond, it was the monks who remembered. If a boy had a questionable aunt who once dabbled in heresy, the monks took note. Reputation mattered, and the church had the receipts. The process was often confidential. Families might submit names and assets through messengers or clerics. Negotiations could last weeks or conclude in a single letter, depending on urgency and proximity to a war. In one case, a monastery helped broker a marriage between two second cousins purely to consolidate a vineyard that both families believed they owned. The bride was reportedly delighted by the wine, if not the groom. It was not only the monks who facilitated such arrangements. Abbesses, particularly those in powerful convents, wielded substantial influence. Many young girls were sent to live in nunneries before marriage, not as a lifelong commitment to the religious life, but as a form of education and preparation. It was a respectable holding pattern for noble daughters until a suitable match could be arranged while in residence. These girls learned Latin prayers, proper manners, embroidery, and how to remain silent in the presence of authority. They also occasionally met the sons of local lords during feast days or supervised visits. And if a glance lingered too long, someone would make a note. Some matches began in these fleeting interactions. Others were decided before either party had reached puberty. The church, in all its intricate bureaucracy, played matchmaker, lawyer, and judge. Priests ensured the union was not consanguineous, meaning the bride and groom were not too closely related, although the definition of too close was flexible. Cousins marrying cousins was common. Sometimes preferred, the important part was that everyone agreed to pretend the math worked out if a marriage needed to be rushed. For reasons of inheritance, illness, or impending scandal, the church could issue dispensations. One papal document allowed a nobleman to marry his cousin's widow with astonishing speed, provided he donated a generous portion of land to a nearby abbey. The abbey later used that land to build a new granary. The widow reportedly used the granary as a private retreat. When her new husband became irritating, in some cases, church officials became entangled in the emotional drama of marriage. As well, there are letters from abbots expressing concern about a bride's reluctance or a groom's reputation for drunkenness. These concerns were often filed away politely and then ignored, but their presence in the records reveals something important. Not everyone was blind to the human cost of these unions. The church also walked a strange line when it came to consent. Technically, marriage required mutual agreement. A bride and groom had to say yes, but when that agreement was whispered in a field overheard by a shepherd and later recited under oath, it could still count. A nod was as binding as a vow if the right people witnessed it. Historians still argue whether the church enforced this rule to protect young lovers or to secure convenient paperwork. For girls living in convents, the transition from potential nun to promised bride could be swift one week. They were learning to illuminate psalms the next. They were being fitted for a gown. The decision often came without warning. A letter arrived, a match was confirmed, and preparations began. Some girls left quietly, others cried into the stone walls and left claw marks in their wooden trunks. Both reactions were considered acceptable. Some convents allowed the girls one final walk through the gardens before departure. These were not lush, Edenic spaces, but small herb patches with rosemary sage and a bench shaped like a coffin lid. Still, they offered a place to breathe, to say goodbye to silence, to holy discipline, and to the illusion of choice. Once the marriage contract was sealed, there was no returning, not unless death or scandal intervened. Once a match was finalized, the convent might host a small ceremony. To mark the transition, a girl would be given a new veil, a different ribbon, or a ring from the family she was joining. These gestures were small but deeply symbolic. They marked the end of one identity and the beginning of another, from novice to noblewoman, from daughter to asset, from girl to wife. There was often a moment, however brief, when the bride walked the quiet halls of the convent. One last time, perhaps, she paused at the chapel. Perhaps she looked back at the room where she had whispered her fears to another girl late at night. These were not dramatic departures. There was no storming out, no protest, only the sound of soft shoes on cold stone and the knowledge that the door was closing behind her. For good in towns and cities, monks and abbesses sometimes also acted as informal chaperones. For meetings between betrothed couples, these were not romantic encounters. The young man would sit stiffly beside the girl, while a monk asked questions about grain yields in the church calendar. If anyone blushed, it was quickly attributed to the weather, and yet, within these arranged and supervised moments, something human occasionally sparked. A laugh, a shy glance, a shared dislike for the fish stew served in the priory kitchen. It was not much, but it was something. And for two people about to be locked into a lifelong agreement, something was better than nothing in rural communities. Without direct access to convents or monastic networks, priests still played a role in matchmaking, often under pressure. A local father might consult the priest, not out of spiritual concern, but to ensure that his daughter's potential suitor did not have an active feud with the neighboring family. The priest might be asked to look into the matter, which meant walking through the fields, muttering psalms and gathering gossip. There are records of marriages being delayed because a priest refused to officiate until a missing pig dispute had been settled. Other times, the church simply looked the other way, as long as the marriage did not threaten the hierarchy, the tithe, or the illusion of divine order. It was allowed to proceed. Once the church had done its part, confirmed the match, secured the paperwork, blessed the intention, it stepped back. The marriage itself would belong to the families. The ceremony would be overseen, of course, and the priest would mumble Latin that no one entirely understood, but the church's real role ended. At the moment the couple clasped hands, from that point on, the bride was no longer under ecclesiastical guidance. She was under her husband's roof, her husband's rule, and if he were particularly devout, her husband's interpretation of divine authority. It is tempting to imagine the monks and abbesses closing their ledgers and breathing a sigh of relief. One more match completed. One more girl placed. One more box ticked on a chart that measured order, stability, and the illusion of divine harmony. But perhaps now and then, one of them paused at the chapel window and watched the girl ride away, wondering just for a moment what might have happened if she had stayed noble daughters and their not-so-fair trades. She wears silk, or something that pretends to be silk, stiff at the shoulders and too tight under the arms. Her sleeves have been stuffed with dried lavender to hide the scent of nerves, and her shoes are wrapped in cloth to keep the mud from soaking through. She is a noble daughter, and she is not walking. She is being walked, escorted through corridors of expectation and down staircases carved by hands. Older than memory, somewhere below a horse waits. Somewhere far away, a man she has never met is preparing for her arrival. Among the nobility, marriage was not merely a union, it was strategy, diplomatic currency, woven with velvet and stitched with land rights. The daughters of powerful families were traded. With the same care one might reserve for battle maps or royal seals if she was beautiful, all the better if she was clever. That could be useful if she was difficult. Someone would find a way to manage her. Her fate had been discussed in drawing rooms months ago, if not years. Perhaps it was spoken of openly when she turned 10. Perhaps it had already been decided when she was in her cradle. Marriage arrangements among noble families were often mapped generations in advance, drawn across parchments by men with ink, stained fingers and long memories. Her name was not just hers, it was a tool, a thread in a web of fealty. Alliance or even revenge, the marriage of a noble girl often took place across great distances. It was not uncommon for her to be sent hundreds of miles to a man whose only claim to familiarity was his crest carved into the corner of a tapestry. She might speak a different dialect than her new family. She might know only a single name and a rumor. He has a limp, or he collects glass birds, or he once rode into battle with his hair on fire. She will learn the truth soon enough. The process of departure was ceremonial. Servants packed her trunks with gowns and cloths, embroidered by cousins she would never see again. A dowry list was read aloud and signed by notaries and uncles. The items included were rarely romantic: 3 dozen pewter plates, 2 kettles, a side table with a broken leg, and a set of combs made from bone. Her trousseau was her introduction, her defense, her ticket to being treated with basic courtesy. Sometimes jewelry was included, heirlooms passed down. Not for sentiment, but for display: a clasp from a long-dead grandmother, a ring inscribed with Latin that no one could quite translate. They were not gifts, but tools, signposts that she came from a house that mattered, that someone might ask questions if she was mistreated. The household staff stood in 2 lines to watch her leave. Some wept, others whispered about the journey. Would the roads be flooded? Would the escort behave himself? Would the new lord be kind or just quiet enough to seem so? The young bride was expected to remain composed. Noble daughters had been trained for this moment. From the age of 7, she had practiced curtsies in front of her mother's mirror. From 10, she had learned how to answer questions without revealing emotion. From 12, she had been told that her destiny was too important to be wasted on something as unreliable as personal desire. And so, she rode through forests that looked like fables and across bridges that moaned beneath the weight of generations. In some cases, the journey took days. In others, weeks sometimes. She traveled with ladies in waiting, selected for their ability to maintain calm under pressure and to carry a bedroll without complaint. Sometimes she traveled almost alone, guarded only by men who had sworn oaths and carried swords. More polished than their intentions, the weather rarely cooperated. Rain turned the roads into rivers. Horses stumbled in the dark. Campfires sputtered under. Wind, she often rode in silence. her face numb from cold, her hands wrapped in cloth. There are accounts of noble brides arriving with frostbite, their feet swollen from boots that did not fit, and servants too afraid to stop and adjust them. When she arrived, there was no grand welcome. The gates opened, and she was led through halls filled with strangers. Her husband might be waiting, or he might be absent, hunting deer or hunting favor. At court, his mother might greet her, offering a smile too tight and wine too warm. She would be shown to her chamber, and the door would close. The noble bride often brought letters of introduction, sealed messages from her family to his. These letters said nothing surprising. They spoke of duty, unity, and the promise of sons. They never mentioned fear. They never asked whether the girl was sleeping. They did not need to marriage among the elite. Was as much a performance as it was a partnership. The household watched her closely. Did she rise early? Did she speak too quickly? Did she treat the servants? With dignity or disdain, every gesture became part of a portrait. She could not paint herself. She was both the artist and the canvas. Held accountable for strokes she did not choose. Historians note that noble marriages were often colder than their peasant counterparts. There was more at stake, and therefore less room for affection. Love was not a prerequisite. It was a liability, something that could interfere with land transfers or complicate inheritance. That said, there were exceptions. Matches where fondness bloomed slowly, watered by mutual respect and the shared fatigue of courtly life. But most of the time, noble girls found themselves woven into households like new fabric sewn into an old tunic. They were expected to match the pattern and not complain when the seams scratched. Sometimes the bride discovered that her new husband was kind. Sometimes she discovered that he was cruel, and sometimes he was simply absent physically, present, but emotionally. As remote as the falcon perched in the mews in those cases, she learned to navigate the halls like a ghost, drifting from chamber to chapel, without drawing attention in households with multiple wives, whether due to remarriage or long-standing arrangements. Tensions could flare. The senior wife often viewed the newcomer as a threat regardless of the age gap or the nature of the match. The younger wife, meanwhile, learned the art of smiling without showing her teeth. The bride's role was clear: produce heirs, manage the household, maintain appearances. The household priest might remind her that her womb belonged to God and her time to her husband. She might nod, though neither statement felt entirely accurate. Her education continued long after the wedding. She learned which maids could be trusted, which doors squeaked in the night, and which members of the household were truly in charge in many cases. The steward wielded more authority than the lord and Ega. Misplaced word in the kitchen could echo through the entire estate by sundown. Letters home were carefully composed. The house is large could mean anything. From the walls are cold to, I do not belong here. He is often away, might be truth or permission. Her mother would read the letter, hold it in her lap and say nothing. Fringe records show that noble brides sometimes formed quiet rebellions. They hosted poetry readings, supported wandering musicians, or kept journals hidden beneath mattress straw. These acts were not public. They were not protests. They were survival. Small flames lit in places where the wind could not reach. The expectation of childbearing arrived quickly, if no pregnancy followed within a year. Whispers began. The fault was always hers. Of course, she might be advised to eat figs, bathe in goat's milk, or sleep with rosemary beneath her pillow. If nothing worked, prayers were offered. And if the prayers failed, pity gave way to disappointment. When a child finally arrived healthy, loud, preferably male, there was celebration, but the celebration was brief. The next day, the household returned to normal, and the mother resumed her duties with one more mouth to feed. And so the noble daughter who once stood trembling at her father's gate, now stood beside her own. She had become the matron, the authority, the keeper of keys. Her sleeves no longer smelled of lavender. Her shoes were worn. Her voice measured. She gave advice to younger girls, remembering what it felt like to arrive with too many expectations and too few answers. She had learned, as so many did, that marriage among the nobility was not a reward. It was not a romance. It was not even a partnership. It was a role played without applause, written by fathers, priests and cures, with ink that never quite dried somewhere near the edge of a walled courtyard. Love? Sorry. That's for troubadours. Beneath the rustle of ivy and the hum of gossiping servants, two figures exchange glances. They are not supposed to. She is promised to another. He is unpromised to anyone, which is part of the problem. There is no letter of intent. Between their families, no dowry being weighed, no priest rehearsing their names, and yet their eyes continue to meet. For all the strict choreography of the medieval marriage market, love was not absent. It was simply inconvenient. Romantic affection, especially among the upper classes, was treated with suspicion, like a fever that might burn away. Reason marriage was a contract, a binding of names and assets. Love was a distraction, a thing for troubadours, fools and people who could afford to be reckless. Still, it happened in the quiet places, in the corridors between expectations, in the hedgerows and gardens, behind chapel doors, or during summer festivals where anonymity arrived with the masks. There are records of couples who fell in love before marriage, who attempted to elope, who whispered promises beneath trees. Older than their family lineages, such unions, when discovered, were rarely forgiven. A noble daughter who defied her family could lose her inheritance, her reputation, and in some cases, her freedom. One documented case describes a girl who ran away. With a stable hand, her father retrieved her 2 weeks later, cut off her hair, and placed her under house arrest in a convent. She later married a cousin of her choosing, but only after his family paid handsomely. To quiet the scandal, in another story, a baron's daughter fell in love with a younger son of a rival house. Their letters, written in Latin to avoid suspicion, were intercepted by a housemaid and burned. The girl was married off within the month to a merchant. 40 years her senior, the boy became a priest. Love among the nobility was a risk, but among the lower classes, it was a different sort of gamble. In rural communities, affection occasionally played a larger role in matchmaking. Peasant families might allow a daughter to marry the boy she fancied, provided his family had a decent patch of barley and no outstanding debts. A young couple might be allowed to speak under supervision, to dance at the fair, to exchange tokens during harvest celebrations. Even so, the pressure to match strategically did not disappear. A girl might love the thatcher's son, but if her father had already promised her to the cooper's apprentice, she would be expected to forget her feelings and obey. And many did, or at least they tried. Love was not considered a reliable foundation. For marriage, it could vanish, it could cloud judgment, it could make a girl refuse a perfectly good offer because she liked someone who smelled of ash and had poor posture. Parents were wary of it. The church was cautious, and society as a whole did not know what to do with it, unless it fit inside a poem. And yet people continued to fall in love behind market stalls, between hay bales, beside candlelit hearths. A glance turned into a smile turned into a word turned into a vow, whispered too quickly in too quiet a place. These moments carried enormous risk. The church recognized what was called clandestine marriage, a verbal agreement exchanged in private with no witnesses. Technically, this could be binding legally, spiritually, emotionally. But if the families disapprove, historians still argue whether the church's acknowledgement of secret marriages was meant to protect genuine love or to trap young couples in obligations they barely understood. In some regions, girls used this rule to their advantage, binding themselves to a partner they preferred, and forcing their families to recognize the match in others, the same rule was used against them, coercing them into marriage with a man they barely knew, based on a misinterpreted promise. Stories abound of lovers who tried to outwit the system. Some succeeded, others failed. Spectacularly, one girl pretended to be married to a soldier, so she could avoid being sent to a monastery when the soldier returned and denied knowing her. She was publicly shamed and then quietly married off to a man with only one tooth and 3 daughters from a previous union. Her journal survives, filled with poetry about longing, loss, and garlic among the merchant class, where reputation mattered almost as much as lineage. Love was tolerated in measured doses, courting was allowed but supervised. Letters were sent, but read aloud. Families arranged coincidental meetings at festivals or church services, giving the illusion of spontaneity while keeping everything firmly under control. Love songs written in the vernacular and passed between households, like smuggled sweets, offer glimpses of longing. Beneath the weight of structure, I would trade your father's orchard for a look. One ballad reads, "I would wear your name before your ring." These were not declarations meant to change the world. They were sighs wrapped in rhyme reminders that even within the most rigid systems, the heart occasionally stirred. Troubadours and minstrels capitalized on this. They traveled from court to court, singing about forbidden love, about knights who defied kings for the sake of a glance, about ladies who wept into fountains. Over choices they never made, their songs offered catharsis. Fantasy, a world where love triumphed over protocol. If only for the duration of a melody. And the irony, of course, was that the very people commissioning these performances were often the same ones, enforcing the marriages that left their daughters weeping. A baron might hire a singer to recount the tragic tale of a runaway bride, only to return home and inform his youngest daughter that she would marry the cousin from the northern estate, whether she liked it or not. In rare cases, love and arrangement aligned, 2 families agreed, and the children happened to feel something beyond duty. These marriages were celebrated with genuine joy. Songs were sung, cakes were baked. People remarked that God's will had been made clear, but these were the exceptions, not the rule for most medieval girls. Especially those of noble or merchant birth, love was something that arrived late. If it arrived at all, it might grow slowly after the wedding, shaped by shared routines and quiet tolerance, or it might remain an ember, glowing faintly in letters never sent and names never spoken aloud. Even among those who married young and bore children quickly, there were moments of rebellion. A glance too long at a night, a daydream while weaving a story told to a maid about what might have been. These were the quiet luxuries of women who were allowed very few, and so within the rigid mechanisms of the medieval marriage market, love remained persistent, inconvenient, occasionally catastrophic, and almost always unforgettable. It threaded itself through the seams of contracts whispered from balconies and danced barefoot across cold stone floors, not because it was allowed, but because it refused to be forgotten. The room is quiet, except for the rustle of fabric, marriage by proxy, portrait, or pure panic, and the steady scrape of a pen across parchment. A servant folds a letter and seals it with wax, pressing down a family crest that the bride has not yet memorized. Outside, a horse waits, not for her this time, but for the message that will confirm her presence, her obedience, and her delivery. In many marriages of the 1300s, the bride arrived before the groom. Marriage by proxy was not unusual, especially among noble families. The logistics of travel, war, or politics made physical presence optional if the paperwork was in order, and the blessings had been secured. A young girl could be married to a man she had never seen. A stand-in would take his place at the altar, often another nobleman or trusted family member, reciting vows on behalf of the absent groom. The bride's response when it came was not always her own. The stand-in might wear a ring, he might bow politely, he might look apologetic, but not too apologetic. After all, this was Tradition marriage was a transaction before it was a relationship, and the body was not required for the contract to be valid. Historians note that proxy marriages often served practical ends. If a nobleman was abroad fighting, negotiating, or simply avoiding the ceremony, a proxy ensured that the alliance could proceed without delay. The bride's family was expected to accept this with grace. After all, what mattered was not the ceremony, but the union. It created, there are records of brides who received their first glimpse of their husbands weeks, even months after the marriage had taken place. One young woman was married by proxy to a man stationed at a distant garrison. When he returned, he mistook her for a serving girl and asked where the wine was stored. She reportedly gave him the wrong answer on purpose. In other cases, portraits substituted for people, a carefully painted likeness on wood vellum or occasionally fabric, would be sent ahead of the groom. The bride would be shown the image offered, a brief explanation, and then instructed to prepare. The accuracy of these portraits varied. Some were flattering, some were imaginative. One Italian noblewoman is said to have fainted upon meeting her husband, having expected a man with auburn hair and soft eyes, and finding instead a bald knight with a scar across his jaw, and a tendency to shout. The portraits were not merely decorative, they were tools of reassurance or at least of delay. "This is the man you will marry," a father might say, pointing to a 2-inch painting. "He seems reasonable," the girl might nod, wondering what could be learned from such a small face, painted by someone who may have never met the subject. In some regions, the use of miniatures and symbolic tokens became formalized. A ring, a glove, or a lace kerchief might be delivered as a placeholder for the groom. The bride would keep it close, wear it publicly, and sleep with it beneath her pillow. It was not affection, it was evidence. Marriage by proxy was sometimes followed by what was called a ratification, a second ceremony, this time with the groom present. But even this could feel surreal. The legal bond had already been sealed. The girl was already a wife. The man beside her, whom she might meet for the first time on that day, was no longer a stranger. He was her husband. His name had already replaced hers in the legal documents. His coat of arms had already been sewn onto the edges of her blankets. Sometimes the proxy arrangement was merely the beginning of a longer absence in border territories or during times of conflict. The groom might not return for years. A girl could enter womanhood, bear children, and manage an estate without ever having shared a hearth with the man whose name she carried. Letters would suffice. Updates were formal and brief. The weather is favorable. The estate yields remain modest. No mention of loneliness. No room for it. There are accounts of girls who were widowed before their husbands ever arrived. A sword to the ribs, a fever during a siege, a ship lost at sea. In these cases, the marriage still counted. The girl became a widow, despite never sharing a table or a bed. She might be sent back to her family, or she might remain in her husband's household. Depending on the terms of the agreement, if her dowry had been large, she might be allowed to keep part of it. If not, she returned with nothing but the title and the memory of a name she barely used. Not all proxy marriages were somber. Some offered strange moments of levity. A monk standing in for a groom once stumbled over the vows and accidentally married himself to the bride. It took 3 bishops, 5 days, and a well-placed donation to correct the record. The bride later said she preferred the monk's conversation, but accepted her fate with good humor. In rural areas, proxy marriages were rare, but not unheard of. A groom working in another town might send a brother or cousin to stand in his place. The bride's family would accept, provided the man could produce letters and a reasonable likeness if he brought wine and bread for the ceremony. So much the better. These arrangements were not romantic, but they were practical. In a world where travel was dangerous, communication was slow, and alliances mattered more than introductions. Marriage by proxy allowed the gears of society to keep turning. Feelings, as usual, came later, if at all. Some women adapted easily. They received their husbands with dignity, listened politely, and learned to manage the rhythm of a shared life with someone who had been, until very recently, a name on a scroll. Others found the adjustment more difficult. There are letters preserved in family archives written in careful script, addressed to mothers, sisters, even confessors, that speak of confusion, disappointment, and in some cases, quiet despair. The bride had imagined someone taller or gentler, or simply more awake during dinner. She had expected to feel something, a sense of belonging, perhaps, or gratitude. Instead, she felt hollow. These feelings were rarely expressed aloud, but they found their way into marginalia, into recipes that called for unnecessary amounts of nutmeg, or into lullabies sung with voices that shook at the edges. Still, the world moved forward. The land had to be tended. The lineage had to continue. The marriage was a legal fact, etched into books that no one would read again unless there was a dispute over the inheritance. And so, the girl, no longer a girl, but not yet fully a woman, adjusted. She learned to speak her husband's dialect. She learned which topics to avoid. She learned to sleep beside someone who breathed heavily and did not always dream kindly. Marriage by proxy, by portrait, by symbol, by necessity. It all led to the same place. A woman stepping into a life she had not chosen, binding herself to a man she had not met, and finding somehow a way to make the story hers. Anyway, she holds a shoe in her hand, not to wear, but to give. Ring, relic. Ragdoll symbols and ceremonies. Across the room, her betrothed shifts nervously, clutching a belt that belonged to his late uncle. Between them stands a priest, squinting at a manuscript and muttering in Latin. It is a marriage ceremony, although it might not look like one. There are no flower petals. There is no swelling music. There is only the smell of wax, wool, and anticipation. The symbols will do the work. In the 1300s, marriage ceremonies were often a blend of the sacred and the symbolic. The church provided structure, blessings, rites, and the solemn authority of God. But the people brought their own meanings. A ring might be present, or it might not. A shoe, a belt, a coin, a jug of ale. These could serve as equally powerful tokens of union, depending on the region, the resources, and the family customs. There was no universal formula. What mattered most was that the intention was clear, that there were witnesses, and that something, anything symbolic, passed between the bride and the groom. The idea was to mark the transition, to seal the promise. The objects used to do so ranged from elegant to baffling. The ring, now considered essential, was not always a given. Gold was expensive. Silver, though cheaper, was often reserved for the wealthier classes among rural families. A simple band of braided hair, carved bone, or even twisted straw could stand in for a ring. The symbolism was more important than the metal. The ring represented continuity, unity, the never-ending nature of the bond, or at the very least, a visible reminder to others that this girl was no longer available in some parts of Europe. The bride handed the groom a shoe to symbolize the transfer of authority in others. The groom gave her a belt or girdle to mark the beginning of shared life. These were not romantic gifts. They were practical items turned ceremonial. They reflected daily life, the realities of work and obligation, of household management and bodily presence. There were other customs too: the lighting of candles from the same flame, the binding of hands with ribbons, the breaking of bread and sharing of ale from the same cup. Each act reinforced the idea of unity, not just of two people, but of two families, two households, two futures, colliding into one. Often uncomfortable present. Some ceremonies took place inside churches, with full ecclesiastical ritual and a board priest doing his best to remember which part came next. Others unfolded in courtyards, at the foot of staircases, or even on fields between properties' neutral ground, where both families could attend and argue about sheep. While pretending to listen, historians note, that location mattered less than clarity as long as the couple made their vows. In front of witnesses and with recognizable intent, the marriage could be considered valid. Even the church, though eager to regulate the sacrament, often tolerated a wide variety of local customs. What mattered in the end was order, as long as the community recognized the couple as married. The church could bless it after the fact. One particularly strange detail: in certain regions, it was customary for the bride to carry salt in her pocket. During the ceremony, the reason is debated. Some claim it symbolized preservation. Others say it warded off evil. One cynical chronicler suggested it was simply to flavor the wedding feast, which often lacked seasoning. Whatever the reason, it was common enough to appear in several marriage contracts. The vows themselves were often simple. "I take thee," or "I will have thee," might be enough, especially if spoken in the local dialect. In many cases, the bride was coached beforehand, repeating the words like a child learning a prayer. Some spoke confidently, others whispered. Some were prompted line by line. The groom, for his part, was expected to be audible and serious. Smiling too much could be seen as mockery. Smiling too little could be interpreted as reluctance. There was a narrow path to walk among the nobility. The ceremonies could be more elaborate. Multiple priests, choirs, banners, and pages announcing the bride's lineage. But even here, symbolism ruled. The exchange of family crests, the placement of a veil, the stepping onto a threshold, all held meaning. A noble bride might be expected to kneel before her husband in some households. She would also receive a symbolic key, granting her control over the domestic domain, or at least the illusion of it. Music, when included, was often played on simple instruments: lutes, pipes, small drums. The melodies were repetitive and easy to remember, allowing guests to sing along even after several cups of weak ale. The lyrics, preserved in fragments, tell stories of unrequited love, of dutiful unions, and of cautious optimism. Wrapped in rhyme gifts were common, but not always pleasant. A bride might receive a brooch, a comb, or a small tapestry. She might also receive a goat, a churn, or, in one documented case, a large wooden spoon shaped like a fish. The symbolism of that particular gift remains unclear, though it was reportedly carved with great care. Feasts followed when possible. Even among poor families, something was shared: bread, onions, cider among the wealthy. The tables groaned under pies, roasted birds, and spiced wine. But always, there was an awareness that the feast was not the end. It was the beginning. The performance was over. The marriage had begun. And that was when the guests left. The candles burned low, and the couple was expected to consummate the union. This too had its own customs. In some noble households, witnesses were appointed to stand nearby, just out of sight, ready to confirm the deed had been done. Beds were inspected the following morning. Sheets were checked. Stories were whispered. If blood was absent, eyebrows were raised. If screams were too loud, people pretended not to notice. In village homes, the practice was less formal. But just as expected, the community had seen the vows. Now they expected results: a child within the year, a promise fulfilled, a cycle continuing. There was little room for delay, and yet even with all the pressure, the ceremonies remained deeply human. Awkward pauses, nervous laughter, a misplaced ribbon, a candle that refused to stay lit, a groom who forgot which hand the ring belonged on a bride who sneezed during her vows. These details, though rarely written down, were part of the memory. The true record. The story retold at gatherings and passed along with a chuckle. The rituals may have been symbolic, but the people were real. Flawed, frightened, hopeful, they stood in shoes that pinched, spoke words they barely understood, and held hands with strangers they now had to trust. And somehow, through the strangeness, the discomfort, and the pageantry, a life began, not a perfect life, not always a happy one, but a life nonetheless. Consent, coercion, and confusing church rules. A breeze stirs the tall grass in a field where no altar stands, where there are no candles, no witnesses in fine dress, and no priest reciting Latin, just two young people speaking in low voices, looking at the ground more than at each other. There is no ring, there is no scroll. But if they say the right words in the right way, at the right time it will count. The medieval church had rules, and then it had reality canon. Law dictated that marriage was a sacrament, requiring the consent of both parties. Freely given, that part, in theory, was progressive. A woman had to agree. A man had to agree. No forced ceremonies were to be recognized unless the vows were spoken without coercion. But interpretation of these rules varied wildly, especially across geography, class, and literacy. What counted as consent? Could it be whispered? Could it be given once and later withdrawn? If a couple claimed to be married but had no witnesses, was the church obligated to believe them? The result was a system that was both inflexible and porous. The church insisted on order, but the countryside overflowed with exceptions. Couples claimed they had spoken vows in barns near wells, in the woods on feast days, or during harvest festivals. Sometimes they were believed, sometimes they were punished. Sometimes their words hung in limbo for years, neither fully accepted nor fully dismissed. And this murkiness led to what scholars now call clandestine marriages. Two people would declare themselves married privately, spontaneously, often passionately, and then attempt to live as husband and wife. If questioned, they insisted the vows had been exchanged. If challenged, they might be forced to prove it. There are court records filled with these cases. A woman claiming she had promised herself to a man in the orchard, a man insisting his neighbor's daughter agreed to marry him. Beside the well, some testimonies were supported by servants, shepherds, or nosy relatives. Others stood alone, unprovable, and unresolved. This system created a strange paradox. On one hand, the church acknowledged that a marriage could be formed by mutual consent alone. On the other, it also punished those who did so without permission. Witnesses or ceremony, marriage became both personal and public. Sacred and scrutinized, the line between a lawful union and a scandalous mistake was perilously thin in practice. Communities developed their own customs. A vow spoken in the presence of family was taken more seriously than one spoken behind the barn. A promise made in daylight carried more weight than one made under stars. Some villages insisted on announcing the union 3 Sundays in a row during Mass. The banns of marriage: if no one objected, the match could proceed. If someone did object, well, then things became complicated. There were also variations in how consent was measured. Did a nod count? A written note? A sigh mistaken for agreement? Some priests demanded that the couple declare their vows in front of the entire congregation. Others were content with a quiet promise made at the altar. A few scandalously took bribes to look the other way. And what of coercion? If a girl was told she would be disowned unless she married, did her yes still count? If a boy was threatened with land loss, unless he took a certain bride, was his agreement valid? Historians still argue these questions. The medieval church had answers, but they were slippery, subject to politics, reputation, and the priest's mood on a given day. In some regions, fathers took matters into their own hands. if a daughter tried to claim a secret marriage to avoid an arranged one. The father might drag her before the local court and demand a reversal if successful. The girl could be punished, sent to a convent, or married off anyway. If unsuccessful, the secret husband gained a family, a dowry, and a lifetime of wary glances from his new in-laws. These disputes were not limited to nobles. Peasant. Families too worried about alliances, resources, and respectability. A girl who claimed to be married without ceremony might find herself ostracized. A boy who refused to honor a spoken vow could be called before the bishop and ordered to fulfill his duty or face penance. Fringe cases appeared in unexpected places. A woman claimed her late husband had married her in secret, and therefore she deserved his inheritance. A man declared himself wed to a girl who had vanished and later tried to marry another. A servant girl testified that her mistress had wed the stable boy one evening during Lent. The bishop declared the timing inappropriate but ultimately valid. The law tried to catch up. By the late 1300s, councils began tightening restrictions, urging priests to document every marriage, to forbid private vows, and to standardize the rituals. But enforcement was uneven in small villages. The rules were distant. In border regions, they were ignored, and even in cities, love and fear found ways to slip between the cracks. This ambiguity left many women vulnerable. A man could claim a clandestine marriage, consummate it, and then deny the union if she became pregnant. Her options narrowed further. She could appeal to the church, but without proof or favor, she often found herself dismissed. The shame was hers to carry the consequences, hers alone to avoid this. Some families insisted on public vows with many witnesses and sometimes even legal contracts. The more eyes, the more ears, the more signatures, the safer the girl would be. But not every family had the luxury of caution. Sometimes haste, passion, or desperation pushed people toward private unions, and sometimes those unions were all they had. And yet, within this tangle of confusion and contradiction, something strangely human persisted. Couples looked at each other and believed the promise mattered. They clasped hands and whispered words, hoping that the field, the trees, the wind might serve as witness. They acted with courage or foolishness, or both, because they believed that love once spoken could not be unspoken. These moments did not always end well, but they happened again and again, in kitchens, gardens, corners of barns, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, not for a feast day or a saint's remembrance, but for a vow that no one heard, and that still changed everything. Widow at 14. Betrothed again by 15. The black veil is heavy. It is too large for her head and smells faintly of lavender and wax, as if it belonged to someone else for too long. She is 14 and she is already a widow. The ceremony is short. A few words are said. Bread is broken. There is no feast, no music, only the low murmur of prayers and the sound of wood creaking beneath mourning shoes before the month ends. Someone will ask her about remarriage. In the 1300s, widowhood was not an ending. It was a pause, often a brief one. Girls married young and young husbands died, often by war, by illness, by accident, by malice. The Black Death had not yet arrived, but infection, starvation, and broken bones claimed lives with alarming ease. A girl could marry at 12, be widowed by 13, and betrothed again before she remembered the name of the first man she had called husband. Among noble families, this cycle was routine. A young widow still held value. Her dowry had already been invested, her fertility proven or assumed, and her status shaped. If she had no children from the first union, she could be married off again without inheritance complications. If she had a child, especially a son, she was often kept within the household as a maternal guardian or steward until the boy reached maturity. Then she might remarry, or quietly fade into a supporting role. No one asked what she wanted. Some widows were given a brief mourning period, black or gray gowns, a small allowance. A room near the chapel. They were expected to weep, but not too loudly. They were expected to pray, but not excessively. They were expected to remain modest and grateful, as if widowhood were a blessing in disguise. Others had no time to mourn. If the family estate needed to be preserved, if alliances needed to be reinforced, if a cousin had an eligible brother, then the mourning gown barely touched her skin. Before it was replaced by another wedding veil, it was not cruelty, it was custom. And custom, as always, marched ahead of emotion. In some cases, remarriage was arranged before the burial. A messenger sent in haste a letter penned while the corpse still lay in the chapel. The girl would receive the news in silence, offer a faint nod, and begin again. A new name, a new husband, a new household. To learn this was not considered harsh, it was considered efficient. There were rules, of course, technicalities that preserved appearances. A widow was expected to mourn for, at least, a customary period, though the length of this period varied greatly. In some places, 40 days, in others, 3 months. In more lenient households, it was measured in Sundays. 3 quiet church appearances in dark clothing, followed by a discreet conversation about new prospects among peasants. The rhythm was similar, if slightly less formal. A widow might remarry within weeks, if she had children to feed or land to tend. Men, especially widowers with young children, often sought new wives, quickly needing help in the home. The marriages were practical, arranged over bread and ale, sealed with a nod and a shared look of exhaustion. It was understood that life did not stop. Not even for sorrow, widowhood was not without its complications. If the husband died without heirs, his family might attempt to reclaim property. The widow could be sent back to her father's house, stripped of furniture, linens, and status, or she might be allowed to stay, provided she remarried within the estate's circle, often to a brother or cousin of the deceased. This kept wealth and land intact. It also kept the widow under the same roof. Historians note that widows held a unique place in society. They were often seen as more experienced, more stable, and occasionally, if only briefly, more autonomous. A widow with no surviving husband or son might manage her own property, make decisions about her household, and even act as a legal representative in court. But this freedom was fragile. It lasted only until someone stronger, richer, or more connected decided otherwise. There were exceptions. Some widows chose not to remarry. If their dowries had been substantial and their families supportive, they could live with modest independence. A few joined convents, not always out of piety, but for the structure and safety it offered within the walls of religious life. A widow could become a librarian, a healer, a teacher. She could walk without fear. She could own her own silence. But most were not given that choice. A girl widowed before 15 might be told that God had tested her and found her strong. She might be reminded that life was short, that women were vessels of duty, that the best way to honor her late husband was to smile for the next one. She might not even be given time to cry, and if she did cry, she was told to do it, facing the hearth, not the window. Remarriage contracts were swift, often drawn up by the same notary who had blessed the first. If the husband's family owed a debt, the widow could be traded to the creditor. If her own family wanted to reclaim influence, she might be paired with someone politically advantageous. Love was not part of the discussion, neither was grief. In rural villages, the remarriage process could be as simple as a visit to the priest and a declaration of intent. The community would nod, mark the change, and return to their fields. There was little sentimentality. Life continued. The bread still needed baking, the lambs still needed shelter. There are fragments of songs that mention young widows, soft melodies about girls in black, about laughter that faded. too soon about the echo of footsteps that never returned. One verse tells of a widow who lit a candle every night for 7 years. Another ends with the girl casting the ring into a river and walking away barefoot. These were stories, of course, embellishments, but they were sung for a reason. Some widows resisted remarriage. They became difficult. They asked questions. They delayed. One noblewoman famously postponed her second wedding 6 times, citing omens, dreams, and a recurring illness. She eventually agreed, only after being offered land, 2 horses, and the right to keep her falcons. She later trained those falcons to ignore her new husband's commands. Not every widow was obedient. Not every story ended with silence. Others played the role expected of them, but found subtle ways to preserve a part of themselves. They kept the first husband's ring in a cloth bag. They refused to take his name off the estate ledger. They sang lullabies he once liked to their children. Even if the new husband disapproved, and some, despite everything, found peace in the second marriage or the third, they built new rhythms, found quiet satisfaction in work or companionship, or the sheer stability of being left alone. They were not always happy, but they were steady, and in a world ruled by chance, that counted for something. Widowhood was not an escape. It was a reset, a pause between performances, a chance to step briefly backstage, change costumes, and re-enter the narrative under a new name. The girl who once stood at an altar with trembling hands now stood at another. Older and more aware, she had seen the inside of a marriage. She had learned where the shadows fell in a household. She knew how to arrange a feast, how to soothe a bruise, how to bite her tongue. She had lost something, perhaps many things, but she had also gained knowledge, and in a world where knowledge often belonged to men, that was no small feat. And so, with shoulders squared and face composed, she stepped once more into the circle. A different ring, a different man, the same ritual, the same expectations, and a future that stretched ahead. Not bright perhaps, but known. Because in the medieval marriage market, being a widow did not mean you were finished. It only meant you were available again. The fire is low, the shutters drawn, and the only light comes from a single beeswax candle guttering near the bread shelf. A girl sits beside her mother, her legs tucked beneath her, her fingers worrying a loose thread on her sleeve. Outside, the oxen shuffle in the barn. Inside, her future is being whispered into being. In the countryside, far from the high courts and echoing cathedrals, marriage was arranged not in public pronouncements, but in quiet negotiations. No heralds announced these unions. No stained glass windows bore their names. They were sealed beside stoves, under rafters dark with soot. As women passed down what they knew, and fathers counted the hens, here the stakes were smaller, but the consequences just as permanent. A marriage could mean the difference between meat in the stew or another winter of onions and hope. And so, even among the poorest households, the matter was treated with solemn care. Girls did not often speak. During these discussions, they listened, they watched, they learned what words mattered and which silences were strategic. Mothers played a crucial role. They were the keepers of unspoken truths. Who in the village had kind hands? Whose father was too fond of drink? Which families neglected their sick? They observed, remembered, and advised, and when a daughter reached a certain age, usually 13 or 14, they began to prepare her, not with speeches but with gestures, a longer apron, a more tightly braided hair, a warning glance when a certain boy lingered too long near the well. Girls were taught to be useful, quiet, clean, but more than that, they were taught how to read a room, how to endure discomfort, how to preserve dignity with no power. This was not framed as oppression. It was framed as wisdom, strength, practicality. The world would not yield for them, so they learned how to bend without breaking. Fathers, for their part, negotiated with blunt tools, land, livestock, reputation, A son with a good, thatching hand was worth more than one with a lazy stride. A daughter who could make cheese and keep peace. In a crowded household was a prize. No one said these things aloud, but they were understood. A glance at a girl's wrists, her stride, the way she swept the floor. These became assessments. If a match seemed likely, both families began the subtle dance of courtship. One built not on flowers or letters, but on bread loaves delivered across thresholds, small gifts exchanged under supervision, and strategic church seating. A boy might walk a girl home from Mass. He might speak to her father about the weather. He might compliment the goat, and everyone would understand what he really meant. Still, the final say often lay with the father or with the priest. If the family was cautious, a girl might whisper her hopes to her sister or grandmother, but rarely to the men. Arranging her fate, if she was lucky, those hopes would align with the arrangement. If not, she would learn to hide disappointment behind a bowed head and well-mannered silence. Some communities practice trial betrothals, an informal understanding that the couple would be observed for. Compatibility. These trials might last a few months, sometimes longer though. Pressure always loomed. A broken engagement could damage a girl's prospects, casting suspicion on her character, her health, or her worth. Once the agreement was in place, preparations began. There was no trousseau filled with silk, no expensive jewelry, but practical items. Were gathered blankets, a comb, wooden bowls. Mothers passed down advice, sometimes blunt, sometimes tender. One village woman reportedly gave her daughter a handful of herbs and said, for fevers, for bleeding, for when the silence becomes too loud. The wedding itself was modest. A priest's blessing, a shared loaf, a cup of cider. Some couples marked the moment with hand fasting, a ceremony in which their wrists were bound together, with ribbon or cloth. Others simply declared their vows aloud in front of family and neighbors. Gifts were humble: a pie, a knitted scarf, an extra hour of help with the cows. Historians note that rural marriage ceremonies were often seasonal, timed around harvests or planting. Spring weddings were common, allowing the new household to settle before winter-autumn. Weddings followed the rhythm of full granaries and community goodwill. Winter was avoided unless urgency demanded it. Once married, the girl moved into the husband's household, often with his parents, siblings, and a confusing hierarchy of aunts and cousins. Privacy was rare, respect had to be earned. The bride was expected to learn quickly, to defer wisely, and to prove her worth through competence, not charm. Life was not cruel, but it was hard. There were chores before dawn, disputes over chores, illness, animals, and aching backs. There were also shared smiles, silent support, and the occasional kindness that bloomed in small places. A second portion of soup, a hand on the shoulder, a new pair of wool stockings. When the old ones finally failed, not every marriage in the village was arranged. Some were born of affection, a boy and girl, who grew up beside each other, who helped bring in the same harvest, who whispered beside the well. But even then, permission was needed. A smile was not enough. A promise had to be blessed, witnessed. Secured, the rules were firm even when the hearts were soft. And so, in these quiet homes, lit by oil lamps and warmed by stubborn fires, generations of women became wives beside men they barely knew or knew all too well. They made soup, made beds, made children, made peace. They endured. They adapted. They told their daughters what they wished. They had known, and the cycle turned again in the village. Love was not a promise. It was a possibility. One that arrived slowly, if at all, and often unnoticed. A shared laugh, a hand held a second longer than needed, a joke repeated only once, just for her. These moments did not alter the world. But they mattered because in these candlelit homes, in the absence of titles and treaties, marriage was not just a market. It was a negotiation between need and hope, between habit and tenderness, between what must be done and what might just possibly make it easier to bear. Scandals, secrets, and sudden elopements. The hour is late. The hearth is cold. A girl's boots are missing. Her father paces the room, jaw clenched, while her mother stands by the window staring into the dark, as if the wind will carry her daughter back. Someone knocks at the door, a neighbor out of breath, his voice low and urgent. The girl is gone, she ran. In the medieval world, scandal did not always arrive with a crash. Sometimes it slipped out the back door in borrowed shoes. Elopements were not common, but they were not rare either. Despite the weight of customs contracts and clerical oversight, some couples still chose flight over submission. They ran not out of hatred for tradition, but out of desperation, fear, or wild, impossible love. They did not always make it far. They did not always succeed, but they ran anyway. The reasons varied. A girl promised to a man she feared a boy, facing a future carved in someone else's handwriting. A pair of friends who whispered too many secrets and realized that marriage might be the only way to keep them. They slipped through the cracks in the system, riding at dawn, hiding in barns, bribing ferrymen, or crossing into neighboring parishes where names could be softened or changed. In some cases, the couple found a sympathetic priest willing to perform a rushed ceremony in exchange for coin silence or shared wine. These marriages, if discovered, could be legitimized. Sometimes the church preferred order, but it also valued the sanctity of vows, especially if they had already been consummated. Once flesh had met flesh, the matter became more complicated. Families, however, rarely saw it that way. A girl who ran could destroy years of negotiation. Dowries might be forfeited, alliances undone, reputation ruined. A father might send servants or cousins to retrieve her. If the boy was caught, he could be beaten, imprisoned, even killed, depending on who he was and who she was. If the girl returned, she might be locked away, shunned, or married off faster than before to ensure she did not try it again. There is a record from 1324 of a miller's daughter who fled with a soldier passing through town. They were caught 3 days later. The soldier was whipped and dismissed from his post. The girl was sent to live with an aunt in another village, where she married a shoemaker and never spoke of the soldier again. Her story was passed down, not as a warning, but as a legend. She ran once, people would say, so do not underestimate her. Among the nobility, elopements could shake kingdoms. A young noblewoman marrying beneath her station could spark duels, political chaos, even war. Royal permission was often required for marriages among highborn individuals. To elope without, it was not just rebellious, it was treasonous. One famous case tells of a baron's daughter who fell in love with her tutor. They escaped under cover of night, forged marriage documents, and lived in secrecy for nearly a year before being discovered. The tutor was executed. The girl was forced into a convent. Her father donated land to the church. In exchange for silence, the girl lived out her life copying religious texts. Her handwriting described as steady, but sorrowful. Not all elopements ended in tragedy. Some couples succeeded. They found sanctuary in sympathetic towns, built quiet lives, and raised children who never knew the danger their parents once faced. These stories, though fewer in number, survive in the margins of letters, in songs passed from mouth to mouth, in the soft pride of families who claimed to descend from people who loved boldly. Elopement, however, did not always mean rebellion. Sometimes it was the only option left. A girl impregnated out of wedlock might flee to find the boy responsible, desperate to turn disgrace into legitimacy. A widower might marry a servant girl in secret to avoid scandal. A couple of modest means, lacking parental support, might wed quietly rather than risk separation. These unions were not always romantic. They were practical, urgent, fueled by circumstance more than passion. Still, even these hurried pairings had room for tenderness, a half-melted candle on a borrowed altar, a nervous laugh. When the groom forgot his lines, a new name scrolled on a church ledger, ink smudged by trembling fingers. These were moments not planned, not sanctioned, but lived and lived deeply. Communities responded to elopement in varied ways. Some turned a blind eye. A baker might leave out an extra loaf. A shepherd might misplace his keys to the barn. A priest might cough strategically and look away. These acts were not defiance. They were understanding. Life was difficult. Love was rare sometimes. Bending the rules was the only merciful thing to do. Other communities responded with swift judgment. A girl who returned from a failed elopement might find her name spoken with caution, her presence at gatherings quietly discouraged. A boy who returned alone could be mocked, beaten, or forced to leave the village. The social cost was high, and the currency was respectability. Fringe cases included false elopements, stories planted to cover up scandal. A girl vanishes, but in truth, she was sent away in disgrace. A boy disappears, but he was taken by illness or exile. The elopement becomes the easier story, more romantic, less shameful. There are poems anonymous, scratched into parchment margins, that describe lovers on the run. We met beneath the elder tree. One begins, and I gave you a name the world would never hear. Another ends with a vow carved into wood. If we do not reach the chapel, at least we reached each other. Historians continue to debate the prevalence and impact of elopement. Some argue it was a rare and reckless anomaly. Others believe it was more common than records suggest, hidden beneath layers of silence, shame, and survival. What is clear is that the impulse to escape, to claim love, choice, or even just the right to decide was never fully extinguished. Elopement sat outside the carefully constructed boundaries of marriage. It was not arranged. It was not negotiated. It was not blessed in advance, but it was real. And for those who lived it even briefly, it was unforgettable. In a world where girls were matched like casks of wine and boys were measured by the fields they would inherit, elopement was the whisper of rebellion in a hall full of commands. It was the candle lit behind the chapel, the boots left by the door, the ribbon found on the riverbank. They knew the cost. They ran anyway. They knew the odds. They whispered vows anyway. And whether they reached the priest or not, whether their story ended in union or in silence, they left a mark. Not on scrolls or stained glass, but on the collective memory of a world that feared love precisely because it could not always be contained. Because in the medieval marriage market, everything had a place except for the ones who ran the ship rocks slightly beneath her feet. She holds the railing foreign wives. Familiar fears. Knuckles white against the morning mist, eyes fixed on a shoreline she does not recognize. Her hair is braided tightly, her gown carefully arranged, her face still. She does not speak the language of. Of the men who rowed her here, she does not know the name of the woman waiting on the dock. She knows only that her name is no longer hers, and her world has been exchanged for another. In the 13th and 14th centuries, marriage did not stop at the borders of a village. It crossed rivers, fields, and in many cases, entire seas. Foreign marriages between noble houses of different kingdoms, duchies, or provinces were among the most powerful tools of diplomacy. A girl could end a war, solidify an alliance, or open a trade route. All she had to do was leave everything she knew behind for noble families. Sending a daughter abroad was not an act of abandonment. It was an investment. Her dowry would be vast, her retinue carefully chosen, her behavior scripted well in advance. She represented her family, her homeland, her faith, and her bloodline. And in return, she was expected to learn quickly, adapt quietly, and produce heirs efficiently. The practical challenges were immense. A girl sent from England to Castile or from Brittany to Bohemia often arrived unable to speak the language, unfamiliar with the customs, and visibly different in manner and dress. Her hair might be braided differently. Her clothing might seem foreign. Even her posture could mark her as an outsider. She did not walk with the same rhythm. She did not kneel with the same timing. She did not laugh at the right jokes. Integration was not immediate. It was rarely gentle servants. Gossiped, courtiers observed cooks, complained that she did not eat the right things. She might be mocked for her accent, corrected for how she curtsied, or scolded for walking alone. It was a test, and she was expected to pass it. Historians write of noble brides who wept silently at night for weeks, forbidden to write home until they had proven themselves. Others were placed under the watch of older women, often widowed, sharp-tongued matrons, tasked with shaping the new bride into someone palatable for court life. These guardians did not cuddle. They instructed quickly and with little room for complaint. The transformation began immediately. She was given a new wardrobe, a new name, a new way to braid her hair. Her old language was spoken only in private. If at all, she learned what to eat and how to sit. She was taught which saint to invoke and how to pronounce her husband as family name. Without hesitation, any hesitation was weakness. If the bride brought a religion different from her new home, the challenges deepened. A Catholic girl sent to a recently converted Orthodox household, or vice versa, was expected to convert quietly or at least adapt to the local rituals. Even among Christians, differences in saints, calendar feasts, or ecclesiastical rites could become points of contention. In some cases, tensions simmered for years. There is a letter from a Flemish noblewoman sent to a small court in Hungary. She writes of being served boiled cabbage daily and pretending to enjoy it. She writes of missing her dog, her younger brother, the bells of her home church. She signs the letter with a new name, but notes in the margin that she still dreams in her old one. Not all foreign brides suffered in silence. Some used their difference as power. A bride with foreign knowledge could influence trade. A girl fluent in multiple languages might serve as a translator. A young woman with knowledge of foreign customs could advise on etiquette and alliances. In rare cases, foreign brides became central figures at court, not just consorts, but diplomats, educators, and patrons. But these were exceptions. More often, the girl was reduced. Her name reshaped her history, softened, her accent erased through repetition. Her homeland mentioned only in the past tense, and there were dangers a foreign bride carried no. Natural allies. Her new family might view her with suspicion if she failed to bear children quickly. She could be blamed for bringing bad luck or worse, foreign magic in times of famine or political unrest. Foreign wives were easy scapegoats. One queen from Navarre was blamed for a poor harvest because she wore green on a feast day. Another was accused of witchcraft for refusing to eat eel among commoners. Foreign marriages happened too. Though on a smaller scale, merchants' daughters married men from distant ports. Traders met women during fairs or pilgrimages and brought them home as wives. Language barriers were dealt with through patience, gestures, and the untranslatable grammar of necessity. These marriages were often marked by long silences. The couple learned each other slowly through shared chores, through frustration, through the soft relief of shared sleep. There was no priest to explain, no tutor to translate, only the rhythm of work, the laughter of children, and the building of trust in unfamiliar rooms. In these cases, adaptation was less about formality and more about survival. A foreign bride might wake before dawn to learn the kitchen's firestones. She might memorize the names of livestock before the names of her in-laws. She might cry when alone and smile when spoken to. Her husband might be kind or not, but in either case, the adjustment fell largely to her. Some foreign brides found unexpected kindness, a patient husband, a servant who took her under her wing, a neighbor who offered help without judgment. These moments mattered deeply. They gave shape to the long days of confusion and the long nights of homesickness. But even in the best cases, a girl sent abroad for marriage carried the weight of exile. She learned to smile without understanding the jokes she memorized, names she could not pronounce. She studied rituals she did not believe. She carved herself into a shape that fit enough, and for those who bore children, the transformation deepened. Their sons spoke a language that was not their own. Their daughters sang lullabies, with melodies unfamiliar to the mother's ear. Slowly, their old life receded. The girl who boarded the ship became a woman rooted in foreign soil. Still traces remained. A hair ribbon kept in a wooden box, a phrase whispered in her native tongue before sleep, a recipe made once a year. Even if no one liked the taste, these fragments mattered. They were not resistance, they were remembrance. Even noble courts, for all their obsession with assimilation, could not fully erase the homes carried quietly in the heart. One duchess from Aquitaine planted lavender wherever she lived. Another from Scotland had her chamber walls painted, a color that reminded her of home. A Polish princess brought with her a dog, whose bark was never understood, but was fiercely defended because foreignness did not vanish. It bent, it softened. It tucked itself into corners, but it stayed and in the great halls. Behind the laughter and ceremony, there were girls still learning to sleep through different bells, women who said the Lord's Prayer in 2 languages, mothers who taught their sons how to say I love you in a tongue no one else in the household understood. Because in the medieval marriage market, the foreign bride was not just a girl. She was a symbol, a solution, a story waiting to be rewritten in someone else's ink. And though she might never return home, though her voice might change and her name be altered, she remembered who she had been. If only in silence, if only in dreams, the door creaks open. Not just a pretty face, fertility, teeth, and hips. A man steps into the room, followed by his brother, then his mother, and finally a woman carrying a lamp. The girl stands still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes lowered. They are here to examine her, not her mind nor her spirit, but her body, her teeth, her hips, her hair, her fertility. She is not a person in this moment. She is a possibility. In the medieval marriage market, appearance was not simply vanity. It was evidence. It was not enough for a girl to be well-behaved, modest or industrious. She had to look the part. She had to embody what a family believed a future wife and mother ought to look like. And so, before the vows, before the feast, before the priest, there came the informal inspection. It was more common among the wealthy, but not absent among commoners. A girl's appearance was her resume. Pale skin suggested she did not labor in the fields. Strong teeth meant she could survive childbirth. Wide hips hinted at future sons. Thick hair was a bonus. Soft hands, a triumph. Quietness when poked or prodded. Essential, these evaluations were not always spoken aloud. Sometimes they took the form of passing remarks. She looks healthy. Someone might murmur a good color to her cheeks. Or more bluntly, her mother had 7 children and never lost one. A compliment, perhaps? A measurement, absolutely, among nobles. These assessments were direct. A prospective bride might be asked to walk the length of a hall, to sing, to smile, to sit beside the future mother-in-law. Her posture would be watched. Her laugh noted, her hair touched, in some cases, a physician or midwife would be discreetly consulted. Do you see strength in her form? Do her hips look promising? The girl taught since childhood to be still and silent would comply. She would not ask why. She already knew historians, record cases of noble brides being rejected. After such inspections, one girl had a slight limp from an old injury. Another had teeth described as not pleasing. Another simply reminded the groom's uncle of someone he disliked. These reasons absurd by any humane measure. Were reason enough, a single flaw could unravel. Years of negotiation, fringe records also speak of more theatrical evaluations. One Italian merchant reportedly required his son's bride to be weighed. Alongside sacks of grain, a German countess demanded that her future daughter-in-law spend a full day in the estate's kitchens to test her stamina. A French nobleman asked his guests to rate the bride's appearance during a banquet. He later claimed it was a joke. She never smiled again among peasants. The inspections were more practical. Was the girl strong enough to lift a full bucket of water? Could she tend to a fire-knead dough? Carry a child on her hip while plucking chickens? These questions were answered not through conversation, but observation. A neighbor might be asked for her opinion. A local healer might be invited to share a drink and weigh in. And then there were the teeth. A girl's teeth, strangely, were a particular obsession. Clean, straight teeth suggested health. Good nutrition and survivability. Bad teeth hinted at sickness, laziness, or poor breeding. There are accounts of girls being asked to open their mouths during marriage negotiations. Like livestock, a little torchlight, a quick glance, a verdict issued with a shrug. This was not considered cruel. It was considered wise virginity. Of course, played its role, though it could not be confirmed visually. Families believed they could sense it through speech, shyness, eye contact. Girls were told to walk slowly, to blush often, to avoid boldness. Too much confidence was dangerous. It raised suspicions. Too much knowledge, even about daily tasks, could be misinterpreted. A girl who spoke too clearly about men was accused of immodesty. A girl who said nothing was praised for her innocence. The contradictions were endless. A bride must be strong, but not too muscular, graceful but not vain, fertile but not forward, soft-spoken, but not dim, a blank canvas, ready for the marriage to write its expectations upon her skin. Sometimes the girl passed to the inspection, sometimes she did not. In either case, she was not invited to share her thoughts, only her presence for those who did not meet the unspoken standards. Life narrowed, the marriage might fall through, the negotiations paused, whispers began. She is plain. She walks too fast. She did not smile at the priest. These were not scandals. They were shadows, enough to dim a future. Even girls who were considered beautiful faced scrutiny. Beauty, after all, came with risk. Too much of it might attract suspicion or competition. A bride too admired might be accused of vanity, flirtation, or sorcery. A girl in one village was sent away after a group of young men fought over her at the market. Her family called it misfortune. The priest called it a curse. And yet beauty remained a currency. A girl with striking eyes or golden hair might receive more offers. Her dowry might be slightly reduced. Her parents might boast just a bit louder. She, meanwhile, learned to use it carefully. A smile for the right guest, a lowered gaze at the right moment, a gentle laugh rehearsed until it sounded spontaneous. What girls were rarely told, though, was that this inspection never truly ended after marriage. The measurements continued. Was she blooming? Was she fading? Did her skin retain its glow? Did she still move with the grace expected of a wife? And when the children came or did not, her body became evidence once more. If she bore sons, her beauty was praised as prophetic. If not, she was blamed. Perhaps she was never as strong as she looked. They would say, perhaps her mother overfed her. There was no escape from the gaze, only adaptation. Some women reclaimed it, a few quietly made jokes. One noble bride, when told her teeth were adequate, smiled broadly and said, "Then I shall bite only on feast days." Another wore too many layers to hide her figure during inspection then. Revealed her actual strength when challenged to a race across the orchard. She won, and the match was sealed with laughter and ale, but most complied. They let themselves be looked at. Evaluated, compared, they turned their faces to the light and hoped their cheekbones would be enough to change the future, because in the medieval marriage market, it was not the mind that mattered most. It was the shape of the face, the weight of the hips, the whiteness of the teeth. The body was the dowry before the dowry. The unspoken contract signed with every glance, and whether the girl smiled or not. The inspection was already underway. The barn smells of hay and smoke, from betrothed to baby maker. Before the harvest ends, it is early morning, and the frost has not yet melted from the beams. A girl, no longer quite a girl, though not yet quite a woman, is already awake. She stirs a pot over the fire, folds clothes still warm from the embers, and watches a cradle shift gently in the corner. Her husband is still asleep. Outside, a rooster calls the world to begin again. Inside, she is already living the life the wedding promised in many medieval households. Marriage did not come with a soft transition. The ceremony might be brief, the feast short-lived, but the responsibilities that followed arrived. Instantly and without ceremony, a girl became a wife. The moment she crossed her husband's threshold, she became a mother the moment. Her body allowed it, and she remained both relentlessly. From that point forward, the expectation of childbirth loomed immediately. A girl married at 14 was expected to carry a child by 15 or sooner if possible. Fertility was not just a blessing. It was proof a house without children was a house without future. A womb that did not yield was cause for concern, pity, prayer, and sometimes replacement. She would not be asked how she felt about this. She would be asked whether she had bled yet. This month, if not, the midwife would be summoned, a cup of broth, prepared, a candle lit. Eyes would turn toward her abdomen as if watching for an answer. It might give without words. Pregnancy was not discussed in romantic terms. It was a duty often framed as an obligation to the family. The estate, the village, or godgirls were taught to expect discomfort, risk, and silence. If a woman cried out too loudly in childbirth, she was suspected of weakness or sin. If she died, it was considered tragic but expected. And many did. Childbirth in the 1300s was perilous. Midwives did what they could with herbs, boiled water, and experience passed from mother to daughter. But infection, blood loss, and breech births were common. The death of a child was mourned quickly, then followed by new attempts. A wife was expected to bear as many children as her body could allow. If she bore sons, she was praised. If she bore daughters, she was encouraged to try again. There was little space to recover. A woman who gave birth was expected to return to her household duty within days, sooner if the household was poor. Babies were swaddled, placed in cradles beside the fire, and left to sleep, while their mothers fetched water, churned butter, tended animals, or prayed. Motherhood and marriage were not separate roles. They were stitched together, indistinguishable. A wife who did not mother, who did not produce, was incomplete, and a mother who did not serve her husband or household was seen as selfish. Some girls took to the rhythm. They found comfort in routine, purpose in repetition. Others struggled. The weight of expectation grew heavier with each child. Each winter, each season, where the fields yielded too little and the baby's cough grew louder at night. There were no journals, no therapists, no time to ask what she had lost. Only the churn of days, the constant attention to survival, and the quiet erosion of the self she once imagined herself to be. And yet moments of softness endured. A hand held under the table, a child's breath against her neck, the silence after prayer. when the fire's crackle felt like companionship. A neighbor's gift of warm bread, a story passed from old woman to young mother, reminding her that others had walked this path and found small lights along the way. There were celebrations too, a child's first steps, a harvest feast, the day her husband returned early from market and kissed her without reason. These were not grand cinematic victories, they were measured in inches. But in a world so concerned with survival, inches mattered. The girl who once wore a wreath of dried herbs now wore a kerchief against the cold. Her hands had changed, her voice had lowered, her eyes no longer widened at every new task, but remained steady. She knew the weight of grain, the stretch of dough, the timing of colic. She was no longer watched, she was relied upon, and still the pressure did not lessen. If her husband died, she became a widow. If he lived, she remained a wife. If she bore too many children, her body weakened. If she bore none, her worth was questioned. Every path forward was demanding. None offered rest. Girls married before the harvest because it allowed them to establish rhythm before winter. By the time the snows came, she was expected to know how to keep the fire burning, the stew from spoiling the baby. Warm, no one explained this, it was shown. Implied, assumed, she remembered the day of her wedding, not for its beauty, but for how it ended. How she walked into a home that was not hers, with a man who was not familiar, and how she told herself she would make it familiar, that she would find something to claim. A corner, a recipe, a quiet victory in learning how to read his silences, and in time she did. Marriage for most girls was not a moment. It was a process of forgetting what they thought life would be and learning how to hold what it had become. She never asked whether it was fair, only whether the stew was hot enough, whether the child would sleep tonight, whether the morning would be warm, enough to wash clothes. Because in the medieval marriage market, a girl's journey did not end at the altar. It began at dawn and repeated itself every day. And every day she rose the cradle. Rocks slowly, the fire has faded to embers. The air is still and outside the window. Good night. The sky has turned that particular shade of soft gray that means the world is between things, between night and morning, between silence and birdsong, between all that has happened and all that might. You have walked a long way tonight, from manor halls to candlelit kitchens, from stone chapels to distant docks. You have stood beside noble daughters wrapped in velvet and peasant girls in linen aprons. You have watched ribbons, tied vows whispered, and futures sealed, not with kisses, but with livestock and land, with quiet prayers and anxious glances. You have seen 12-year-olds measured for motherhood and 14-year-olds dressed in mourning, then marriage again. You have listened to shoes being traded, like promises, portraits being kissed before introductions. You have watched girls leave, their language behind, trading familiar hills for foreign palaces, learning to sleep through bells they do not yet recognize. You have watched them learn when to bow, when to speak, and when to say nothing at all, and through it all, beneath the contracts, the scrutiny, the obedience, you have found moments of something gentler, a stolen glance, a dish cooked the way her mother once made it, a lullaby hummed in a language her children would never understand, but one she could never let go. Because even in a world that treated girls like signatures waiting to be assigned, they still found ways to exist, to remember, to survive tonight. Perhaps you also remember something: how far we have come and how far there still is to go. You remember that behind every faded name in a ledger was a girl with cold feet and a beating heart. That behind every marriage contract was a moment of silence where someone held her breath and waited to see what came next. And now, so do you. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to know every date, every duchy, every ritual. Just hold the shape of the story, the rhythm of repetition, The sound of wool brushing stone as a girl walks toward a doorway she cannot yet see through. Because the past does not need to shout. It only needs to whisper. So let the story quiet itself. Now let the footsteps fade. Let the ribbons slip through your fingers. Let the hearth grow soft and low. The girl is asleep now. The vows have been said. The baby is breathing evenly in the cradle. The wedding candles have burned down. The stew has cooled. There is nothing left to prepare. You may rest now too. You are not being measured. You are not being matched. You're not being watched, only held, just for a little while until morning.